Welcome to Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how US government policy affects your bottom line long after the presidential polls have closed. And of course, today we're talking all things Harris-Walz, what this VP pick means for the ticket, if in fact it means anything at all. We're going to be hearing from Tobin Marcus, Wolfe Research head of US policy and politics, to get his take and then look also whether the odds have changed with this new pick. And of course, can't do anything without my co-stars, Ben Werschkul in the Capitol, and of course, our very own Rick Newman as well in New York City. Want to start things off with Ben. What's on your note card? I mean, we're off for a few days and all of a sudden everything has changed.
Yeah, I've got two note cards for you guys. It's a double week. The first one is Walz, as you mentioned. Sort of, we now have a full cast of characters for this election season. We have running mates for both sides, and we also have a lot of evidence that the Harris-Walz ticket is picking up steam in the polling. So what I've tried to do is take notes on where a Harris-Walz administration, if that is what comes to pass, would be different from a Biden-Harris administration. And there's a few interesting elements of it too. I have three. Rick, you can add to the list if you want. The first one here is on the care economy. That is the child tax credit, paid family leave, issues like that. That's always been an issue for Kamala Harris. Walz doubles down on that. That was a big priority for him in the last couple of years in Minnesota. He had a Democratic state Senate, Democratic state House, and he was able to pass a lot of things, a $1,700 tax credit, child tax credit, issues like that. It's a big priority for him. So you can see that they're going to focus even more on that. TBD if they can pass anything, if they win and the Democrats don't control the House and the Senate, but that's a big priority for them. Second is trade, I think is an interesting one that'll be one to watch for the next few years. Walz he represents Minnesota. It's a really rural state, and he's long seen the effects of tariffs on farmers. His district, when he was a congressman, was incredibly rural, southern part of the state. And as governor, he was there during the Trump era when those tariffs were enacted. He was vocal about that. So there's a question. Kamala Harris is a bit of a blank slate on what she would do with trade and tariffs. So we don't really know. But that's another area that I think you could see a little bit of difference if that's the administration that comes to pass. And then the third is just sort of some signs we've seen of whether Harris would be more friendly to business. And we've seen a lot of those over the last couple of weeks, and we saw some this week. Wes Moore, the Maryland governor, was on CNBC talking about how maybe the dynamic should change. So there's hints there and that we can get into of how it might be different. So those are my three. Rick, what do you have?
Ben, could you hold up those index cards?
Sure. Yeah, I have two. The other one is about stock market.
Where do you get index cards these days? Do you have to buy them used on eBay?
Amazon. They can get anything on Amazon. You're good.
They still have them? Okay, I think maybe Yahoo should get Ben an iPad, but at any rate, I guess...
I'm going to have an overhead projector, too. Next week, I'll have an overhead projector. We can go the full.
I guess
old school.
So the big story recently has been Tim Walz. I mean, I confess I knew nothing about this guy before he came out of nowhere to be her VP pick. I'm not paying that much attention to Tim Walz at the moment, and mainly that's just because the vice president just almost never makes a difference. So we're going to have Tobin Marcus on in a few minutes. I am going to ask him whether Kamala Harris made a mistake by not picking somebody from what is really a battleground state, such as Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. But I mean, he's interesting. He's affable. I'm kind of looking past him. However, the surge among the Harris-Walz campaign, and Rachelle, when you said Harris-Walz, that was the first time I think I'd actually heard it, said that way. The Harris-Walz campaign or the Harris-Walz administration, if they win, it sounds weird to me right now, but maybe it'll start to sound more familiar. This surge is, frankly, amazing. I mean, Biden was like a write-off. A month ago, it was sorry, microphone. But like a month ago, Biden, it looked like he had no chance. And I just looked just a minute ago at the Real Clear Politics aggregate of election odds, and for the first time, Harris is ahead of Donald Trump in the betting markets, with about 50% saying she's likely to win and about 48% for Trump. And we're seeing polls that show them tied. And again, remarkably, the Center for Politics
ahead in some,
right? The Center for Politics at University of Virginia found now Harris is tied with Trump in Georgia. So they changed their rating for Georgia from leans Republican, or it might have been likely Republican, I don't remember. And now they're calling that a toss-up. I mean, these are seismic changes, given that this campaign has only been going on for some while. So the real question is, how long does this momentum last? But I mean, if you're a Democrat, this could not have gone better.
And to be fair, I mean, everyone sort of had the Biden-Harris sort of playbook of how things go, but we didn't really have a good idea of what Harris by herself and with this new vice presidential pick, how different that is. Do we have enough to go on in these very early days that really merits this momentum that we're seeing here, Rick?
I mean, so the important thing that I noticed is that there is no discussion of policy among the Harris-Walz campaign at the moment. They are just riding enthusiasm at this point. Now, the Trump campaign, a bunch of Republicans, huge backers of the free press in the United States. Suddenly they're complaining. Yeah, right. I mean, we're okay. Trump calls us the enemy of the people, for what it's worth. But now Trump's complaining Kamala Harris isn't doing any press conferences. She's not doing any interviews. I mean, as a journalist, yes, I want her to take hard questions and answer hard questions, and I assume that that's going to happen. But if I were her campaign, I would do absolutely nothing to interfere with the ride these candidates are taking into the stratosphere at the moment. Now, I do assume the air is going to come out of this campaign at some point. She is going to have to do some interviews, talk to the press. But if I were the campaign, I would just keep going with this until the end of August.
And so we have to, of course, talk about the economy, something that people are prioritizing as they do in every election. What do we know so far, Rick? What are you working on?
Well, I mean, Ben and I have been working since like the beginning of the year, probably, on charting and making matrices of the differences between, what used to be Trump and Biden, and now it's Trump and Harris, but it's kind of the same thing on all these policy issues. The one interesting thing that happened during the recent days is we had this kind of weird stock market meltdown for a couple of days that was related to two things. I mean, we've had this big sell-off, and Trump called it the Kamala crash. But if it was the Kamala crash, then I guess you have to say it will also be the Kamala recovery when the market comes back, which it has started to do as we were taping this. But there was this little sell-off in markets that gets into what central banks are doing with interest rates, including in Japan. So it's like central banks competing with each other. Some are raising, some are lowering. They're out of sync, and that was part of the problem. Also, some concerns here in the United States about are we possibly getting to a recession. Now, Ben, why don't you lay out for people how Trump uses the stock market in his messaging, because you've got a nice piece on that.
Yeah, so I did a project, and I don't recommend this for folks, but I went through pretty much everything I could find of how Trump has talked about stocks.
Better you than me, brother.
Yeah. So it was since Joe Biden took office, every comment he's ever made on stocks. And I broke it down into 5 stages. So there's the 5 stages of Trump over the last 2 years. I'll run through it really quick. 2021, the market's going up. He's still taking credit. Basically, he's in Mar-a-Lago, but it's still, any gains are thanks to him, even though he's not president anymore. 2022, the market's going down. Now it's all Biden's fault. And we're about to head into a depression. Of course, we're not. 2023, the market's going back up, and he's kind of more mixed on it. There's times where he's actually saying, stock market's not that important. It's only for rich people, which is the most un-Trump kind of comment I'd ever seen. And then back to this year, he's taking credit again. Now that he's in the primary season and he wins a primary, he claims that he's in the head. I sort of lay that all out to sort of point out that Trump is very opportunistic on that, and he's really trying to. But as Rick noted, the market went down on Monday, and it's kind of been mixed the last few days. So Trump has been quiet again. He's still saying there's going to be a depression if Kamala wins, which is by stage 5. So we're still in kind of stage 5 of this right now. And the question is whether there's evidence to back up and the market goes down, and he has a real issue here.
So Trump also said that markets would tank if Biden got elected in 2020. Was that one of the 5 stages, or is that like preliminary, the 5 stages?
Yeah, that's stage 0. That was
stage 0. Okay.
That was the campaign. Yeah. So this was
That's
all
the baseline.
posed. So. But the thing about the stages is there's 5 of them, but they're basically the same couple just over and over again. Either if it's going up, it's thanks to him. If it's going down, it's somebody else's fault.
Okay, so I track the stock market under Trump and Biden, and in fact under all presidents going back to Jimmy Carter in the 70s. So I'm going to quiz the audience here. Ben and Rachelle, if you want me to put you on the spot, I will. But so who do you think has a better stock market performance as of August 8th in the 4th year of their presidency? Joe Biden with Kamala Harris, or Donald Trump with who was Trump's vice president again? Mike Pence. Oh yeah, Mike Pence. So I'm going to give you the answer. Trump or Biden better stock market at this point? It was Trump. The S&P 500 cumulatively was up 48% by this point in Trump's presidency, and under Biden-Harris, it's up 37%. So it was up under both. And for what it's worth, just going into the future, in 2020, now, of course, that was the economy was going haywire because of COVID, and then all of a sudden the Fed came in with all this monetary stimulus that actually created a stock market boom. But from about the middle of August until Election Day, stocks kind of flatlined in 2020. So probably the most Trump is going to get to Election Day is 48%. So for numbers geeks, if the market improves, if there is a rally during the next couple of months, which some analysts think there will be, it's possible the Biden-Harris stock market will end up doing a little bit better than Trump. But they're, actually fairly close. And it's worth reminding people, the president, for the most part, doesn't drive the stock market. The president doesn't have nearly the power of the economy over animal spirits in the market that people think. But, of course, people do give the president credit or blame. So there's that.
Yeah, I would definitely say if you're looking to understand what's going on in the market, this is not the political rhetoric right now is not the way to do it, but it's interesting to understand the politics of it.
It's true, and usually we don't see huge reactions from the markets with an election, but you have that backdrop of the Fed's next moves, and then the economy slowing down. So a lot of things in this stew here. We'll have to leave it here for now. Ben, love you as always. We'll be seeing you next week. We'll take a quick break, but stay with us on Capital Gains.
Get some new index cards.
Welcome back to Capital Gains with Yahoo Finance. Rick Newman still with us here. We want to bring in our guest to talk about the Harris-Walz ticket. We have Tobin Marcus, Wolfe Research, head of U.S. policy and politics, to give us his take on this ticket. So I first want to talk about these potential tickets that we now have. We have the Trump ticket, we have the Harris ticket, and then the potential mix of what might happen in Congress as well, the balance there. So as we sort of start with a look at the macro aspects here, how much has the scenario changed here? And what does that actually mean in terms of how this affects things like people's taxes?
Well, it's been a dramatic change since Harris swapped in, replacing Biden about 3 weeks ago. At the time, I think the odds were at least 70% that Trump was going to beat Biden. Certainly all of our conversations with investors were very, very focused on planning for that Trump eventuality, on the assumption that that's where we were headed. At this point, it looks much more like a toss-up. I think it's an open question whether or not you look at Harris or Trump as a very slight favorite at this point, but it looks very, very, very close. We'll see whether or not the strong polling that the Harris-Walz ticket is putting up so far will be sustained. But, much more, sort of symmetrical distribution of risks at this point, where you actually do need to worry about both eventualities. Taxes certainly will be one of the hottest policy debates next year. That's one of the things that kind of has to be dealt with no matter who wins the election, as opposed to the more elective elements of Trump's agenda that he's been running on, like tariffs. Taxes, we have $4 trillion worth of tax cuts expiring at the end of 2025. All the individual and pass-through pieces of the 2017 Trump tax package are expiring, while the corporate and capital gains changes are mostly permanent. And no one wants to let those expire wholesale. I mean, Trump wants to get them extended completely. Biden has proposed to extend them for households below $400,000, let them expire above that. Harris has largely adopted that Biden position on it. So, you're looking at a delta of, $1.5 or $2 trillion worth of taxes over the next 10 years, largely hitting those top 5%. And then that sets up for a big negotiation where, with those as the sort of starting positions from Democrats and Republicans, if we end up in divided government, which is probably what we're looking at if Harris wins, then that's going to be a sort of big negotiation that lasts for the entire year. And even if Republicans sweep, theoretically have unified control, there's still a lot of contentious elements of that that'll have to be nailed down within the Republican congressional coalition, since they'll need essentially unanimous support.
First question from me is, to me, this has been a remarkable ascent from Kamala Harris, almost as much as Democrats could have hoped for. How far is she going to go? I mean, she's basically gone from pretty far behind Trump to now tied with Trump and ahead in some polls. Is she going to keep going through the convention, or is something going to bring the air out of this campaign?
So my guess would be that we don't just sort of linearly project the trajectory that she's been on forward in the future, and she ends up opening up a sort of big lead in the weeks ahead. That does not feel like where we're going. My guess would be that the sort of polling averages plateau with her in a modest lead nationally in the sort of 1.5 to 3 point range, and then like very, very slight leads, as we're generally seeing now across a decisive swath of the swing states. But I don't think this is going to be a universe where she opens up some big lead. Similarly, I think there's some downside risk relative to where she is now, just as Republican attacks have some time to sink in as we get past the sort of the honeymoon phase, the sort of media treating the Harris campaign as this fun, shiny object, and start being a little bit more critical. In particular, if she keeps ducking interviews and sort of antagonizing the press in that way.
So the VP pick, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. But is Tim Walz going to make a difference for Kamala Harris?
The short answer is no. I think that to the extent that you have a concern about the pick, it's about foregoing the benefit that Shapiro might have given in Pennsylvania. So I think there's an opportunity cost to going with Walz, just because the sort of empirics of this are very much that VP picks have some home state benefit, don't generally matter nationally. I mean, Trump and Vance seem to be salivating at the prospect of going after Walz's record in Minnesota. The effort to portray Minnesota as kind of a socialist hellscape does not necessarily seem to me that it's going to work. But they have things to say. They're comfortable going after him, if nothing else. So I think it's sort of a
don't Minnesota-fy Texas.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so a month ago, Joe Biden was still the candidate. And there was this sort of prevailing wisdom that inflation was just going to sink Biden's reelection odds. Now, we've been reporting on this forever at Yahoo Finance. Inflation rate is down. I mean, it's close to 3% now, which is a normal rate. But then, consumers say, I'm still very unhappy about inflation. And what they're telling you is, yeah, but all the price increases of the last 2 or 3 years are still there. Nothing's getting cheaper. It's still there. So the idea was that inflation was just going to kill Biden's reelection odds. Now you look at Kamala Harris, number 2 in the Biden administration. She's also, in theory, responsible for inflation if you're a voter. And yet she's now, ascendant in the polls. Does this tell us, perhaps, that inflation is not a Democrat killer in this year's election?
Yeah, so I'll make a few comments there. So one, I certainly agree with your notion that the increase in price levels is what was bothering, what has been bothering voters, not just the run rate of inflation. You run focus groups, people will say, when are prices going to come back down? Like, obviously, they're thinking about that differently than economists and investors would, worry about deflation in that case. And then the last thing I would say is in 2022, when inflation really was running out of control in a current run rate, as everyone expected, voters said in exit polls that was the number one problem, but it did not sink Democrats down ballot. Democrats had a pretty good year in the House. The much predicted red wave never really came about. And when you looked at the crosstabs and you looked at voters who said, their family had been sort of personally hurt by inflation, and those who said that the economy was not so good, the sort of second worst punch on a standard economic polling question, they still voted for Democrats in numbers similar to the overall electorate.
And as we're talking about the consumer, some of the other things that obviously hit the pocketbook hard when you're talking about student loan debt, obviously some stark differences here. Do we have enough clarity on what the Harris-Walz ticket looks like when it comes to things like student loan debt and how they plan on paying for these things versus some of the propositions that the Trump campaign is making? I
do think that it's a little bit unsettled in terms of exactly where they will try to find their points of distinction from Biden. Certainly there will be some. I think, like, for now, the base case should be they sort of pick up the Biden agenda and run with it, but that's not going to be the case wholesale across the board. They will make some decisions differently. But realistically, I think so much of the determinant of what has actually happened under Biden have been congressional and litigation factors that I don't think that the actual policy outcomes are going to be hugely different. Student loans, I think, are a great example. Biden initially was uncomfortable about doing something big on forgiveness, was kind of talked into it by more progressive staff. They had their first big effort in 2022, I guess. That got blocked by courts. They're now in the middle of another big effort that's also probably going to get blocked by courts. So, there's the agenda on the one hand, and then there's the question of what you can get through Congress and the courts on the other. And the differences between Biden and Harris, I think, are so far to the left of what either the judicial veto points will allow or what the congressional veto points will allow, that I think is going to be relatively limited areas where there's potential for big movement.
Tobin, what are the potential Harris-Walz vulnerabilities on economic issues? I mean, I would think that, for example, if Kamala were to say again, oh, yes, I'm still for Medicare for all and for the Green New Deal, that would be a problem, obviously. She's clearly not doing that. I mean, she's obviously running as much more of a centrist than she did when she tried for the Democratic nominee in 2020. So she's going to have to define herself on some issues. What vulnerabilities does she face?
I think the question in large part is going to be how successful she is in pivoting away from some of those policy positions that she took in 2019 and 2020, because I completely agree that if she were to run on her Democratic primary campaign platform from 2020, which included decriminalizing border crossings and banning fracking and Medicare for all, among others, that would be, I think, politically toxic and a sure loser. Of course, she's not doing that. I think from an investor perspective, it is, I think looking back at that campaign, that was basically reflected her assessment of what primary voters wanted to hear, rather than sort of sincere commitment to things like Medicare for all or banning fracking. So I don't think that it's like a huge, painful climb down for her to run more to the center. But, Republicans still see all of those positions that she's taken in the past as being huge vulnerabilities, with the immigration piece of it in particular complemented by the sort of disputed portfolio that she had during the Biden administration, where some people have characterized her as a border czar, even though formally she was more just in charge of push factors from the Northern Triangle. But they feel like they have plenty of ammunition to go after her. And the question is, to what extent is that stuff going to stick if she's out there on the campaign trail saying, no, of course I don't support banning fracking. Oil and gas production's at all-time highs under the Biden-Harris administration. If she's disavowing those policy positions, it is tends to be challenging, I think, to make people pay a political price for flip-flopping if they've sort of unequivocally disavowed their past positions.
Just one short point on that. To my knowledge, Biden has not once publicly pointed out or tried to brag about the fact that that oil and natural gas both are at record levels of domestic production. Maybe Kamala Harris maybe it's a little easier for her to do that if questions on it, because she wasn't the one who signed the Keystone XL cancellation in January of 21. Can she maybe go a little more toward the center on fossil fuels?
I think it's a pure question of political strategy. I think the Biden administration, we have seen basically not wanting to alienate green groups. And I think they've overtuned on that. I think they're a little bit scared of their own shadow in terms of the possibility of backlash from the environmental left, which is why they're not touting the objectively good talking points that they have. It's a mixed record, of course. The oil and gas industry does not love the LNG export approval pause. It's not as if they've done nothing that has elicited criticism from traditional energy advocates, but they do have talking points to point to in terms of production. So, I think that the way you would see a shift there is if Harris just feels more secure in the support of environmentalists by virtue of who she is, by virtue of her record on things like environmental justice, such that she feels she can, make more of a concerted pitch to voters in the middle and kind of count on the environmental left not to get too mad about sort of the messaging is distinct from what they expect the policy will be.
Certainly a long road to November. We'll all be watching closely. So we shall see indeed. Tobin Marcus, thank you so much for joining us on Capital Gains. And of course, our very own Rick Newman and our Ben Werschkul as well, who've been joining us today for this session. Thanks so much. And we'll see you next time on Yahoo Finance.